Welcome back to another video for our project CRZ. Today we're going to start tackling the suspension. We've got some lowering springs and some old wheels on here that we're going to pull out, throw some new parts in there, and start dialing in the suspension that we want for the final build. So let's get started. So when we bought the car, it came with these giant Koenig Deceptions. These are 18 by 8 plus 40. We're going to be replacing those with some Enki TSVs. These are 17 by 8 and they're plus 35, so they stick out a little bit farther. We've got some new tires as well because the old ones are bare minimum tread life, so we're starting all fresh with wheels. We also have some Street Basis Z adjustable coilovers, and we have a bunch of new Honda OEM suspension parts as well to replace. So today we're just going to start on the rear axle and go over the removal and reinstallation of those suspension parts and drop it down a little bit more. First step is going to be getting this jacked up and pulling the wheels off, so let's do that. So the rear is pretty simple in here. We've got the spring up front, just mounts bottom and top, and then the shock mounted down there, and it goes all the way up into the trunk. So it's fairly simple and fast to change out these parts. We've got old H&R springs in here. We're going to be replacing, of course, with the ones included with our Street Basis kit. So let's dive in. I'm going to use another jack here just to support the axle while we unbolt and remove these if there's any tension still in the spring. Just so that it doesn't bounce lower and damage anything, pull out any hoses or things like that. In the trunk here, we have the access panels that can be popped off with a plastic pry tool to reveal the top nut for the rear shock. It's quite easy to access. So if the hardware on top of your shock is as rusted out as mine is, it's a great idea to apply some penetrant such as PB Blaster and let it sit for a few hours. This will make it super easy to get the nut off without rounding it off or stripping out the Allen key inside of the shock. Once that's ready, we can use a 5mm Allen key and a 14mm wrench to start loosening the hardware on top of this shock. Keep in mind it'll be useful to have a long handle Allen key to give you as much leverage as possible against the nut. Now you can just use a regular ratcheting wrench to get this off sometimes, but having the Allen key in the center is really useful to keep the shock from spinning. If your hardware is still a little bit rusty like mine is and pretty grabby, or if you're installing the new hardware and need to torque this nut down, it's super important to use the key to make sure that center tube of the shock doesn't spin while you're trying to remove the hardware. Once the nut and top wash are removed, we can go ahead and slowly lower the rear axle until we have just enough room to get the spring and the perches out from the frame. Now there are some wires and the brake lines here that clip in a couple spots with some tight-fitting rubber grommets, so if you need a little bit more slack to move the axle without damaging those, this is a great time to pull those out of their little mounts. We also need to remove our bottom bolt to get the shock tube out. This will take a 14mm socket, and if you have to destroy yours to get it out or it's damaged in some other way, here's the official Honda part number for a replacement. Now we can pull the spring and perch out as well as the shock assembly. Make sure to keep track of and save any rubber bushings or grommets that are associated, as you'll probably need to reuse these, whether you're installing OEM replacement parts or aftermarket. So our coilovers did come with washers and bushings for the shocks as well as a spring mount, but depending on the brand of aftermarket parts you have, or if you got just some OEM parts, you may not have all the hardware you need. So double check what comes with whatever you purchased, and if you're missing anything or some of your factory hardware is damaged and not reusable, make sure you buy all the parts you need before you get started. Once any hardware is transferred over and we have the dust boots and grommets all installed on the new parts, it's time to mount them back up on the axle. I'm going to set the springs in here first and lift the axle with the jack just enough to get the springs seated in place. Then we can insert the shock by pressing the top through the frame into the trunk and then using the lower bolt to hold it in place on the axle. So for this coilover install, we set it to the lowest height setting. For factory springs, you're not going to have this adjustment, and with other brands you may have different mechanisms or tools to set the height, so make sure you read the instructions that came with your parts so you know how to set the height of your coils. If you unplugged any hoses or wires earlier, make sure to reinsert their grommets into their right places on the frame now. After double checking that you have both rubber bushings installed on both sides of the trunk, as well as the center metal spacer, jack up the axle to push the shaft of the shock up through this hardware. Tighten up and torque the lower bolt to 40 pound-feet. With the axle jacked up just high enough to start compressing the shock, we're going to reinstall our top washer and nut and tighten these down to 22 pound-feet of torque. Now that everything's installed and tightened up, we can get our wheel back on and get this car down on the ground. Okay, so with that, the rear suspension is on, the new wheels are on. It's fairly straightforward, as you can see, and not too difficult at all. We'll be doing the fronts in a separate video, because that is a little bit more in depth, but it's still not too bad. Even with the maximum drop height here, there's still a little bit of room under the fender without any modification. We'll have to test it on the street, of course, to make sure we don't hit anything over some bumps, but other than that, it's looking really good. So keep an eye out for the next video for the front suspension, and we'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.